hopefully coming to my talk. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers of the conference, in particular the Australian Embassy, TESOl, and the university for inviting me to this conference. This is a very exciting conference. So many presentations with exciting topics. So I'd love to talk about the application of the newly developed field of cultural linguistics to the area of teaching English as an international language, which is itself a recent paradigm in teaching English to speakers of other languages. Those of you who attended my talk yesterday would know more about cultural linguistics. I don't have the time really to go in depth about what cultural linguistics is, but it's a multidisciplinary field of research that has a life of about 1.5 decades. I have, over the past 15 years, I have developed a theoretical framework as well as an analytical framework for cultural linguistics. And it has been growing very fast. There are 2 key publications that came out last year. One is Advances in Cultural Linguistics. This one. This book is quite thick, 800 pages. I edited this book, 32 chapters from 30 different languages, and of course, my own monograph, published by John Benjamin last year. So cultural linguistics explores the interrelationship between language and cultural conceptualizations. Cultural linguistics explores those features of human languages that encode culturally conceptualized, conceptualizations of human experience. For cultural linguistics, languages are archives, or if you like, repositories of cultural conceptualizations that have coalesced at different stages in the history of speech communities. Those of you who are interested to know more about cultural linguistics, you're more than welcome to email me and I can send you PDF versions of my recent publications about cultural linguistics. There are a lot of YouTube talks of mine available also online. So, in a nutshell, this diagram represents the theoretical framework of cultural linguistics, where the bigger picture is cultural cognition, which encompasses cultural conceptualizations and language, cultural conceptualizations of cultural schemas, cultural categories, and cultural metaphors that are encoded in features of human languages, including morphosyntax, meaning, and discourse. This is the analytical framework of cultural linguistics, as I said, that cultural conceptualizations underlie the features of human languages. Now, I'd like to focus on a key concept in cultural linguistics, in the application of cultural linguistics for teaching English as an international language. And that is the notion of competence. To give you a bit of background about this buzzword, or the magic word, competence, in English language teaching, we all know that the obsession with the word competence started with Noam Chomsky making a distinction between competence and performance. And of course, language teachers were really trying to find out what linguists had to say about language teaching. And so we quickly tried to stick to the notion of competence as defined by Noam Chomsky. Later on, Del Hines criticized Chomsky's notion of competence and said it's quite narrow. It does not include the appropriate use of language. So again, Hines' notion of competence became very popular in language teaching. It came to be known as communicative competence. And people like Chris Candelan talked about the target or the aim in language teaching should be developing communicative competence. And what is communicative competence? The ability to know when, what to say, to whom. The appropriate or acceptable use of language. And who decides what is appropriate? Native speakers of language. This was what they had in mind, that the appropriate use of the language is what native speakers would say. Later on, people like Canale and Swain, they talked about competencies within communicative competence. Discourse competence, grammatical competence, strategic competence, sociolinguistic competence. It was an era where people were just trying to come up with different names to different competencies. So competence was the real buzzword in language teaching. Lyle Bachman, scholar in language testing, came up with, again, a list of competencies. Language competence, which includes pragmatic competence, organizational competence. Organizational competence will include grammatical competence, textual competence. Pragmatic competence will include elocutionary competence, and sociolinguistic competence. So the list of competencies was getting longer and longer. During 1990s, Michael Byron came up with the notion of intercultural competence as a reaction to communicative competence. So he emphasized that it's not only learning about the target culture and what is appropriate. So we need to learn about intercultural competence because we have two cultures communicating with each other. As he said, he was talking about a need for an intercultural dimension to the notion of competence. Well, he said, second language learning naturally involves exposure to and interaction with the speakers from a different cultural background. According to Byron, intercultural competence includes knowledge and skills that enable speakers to communicate effectively and appropriately with speakers of other cultural backgrounds. The issue that I have with Byron's notion of intercultural competence are twofold. One is that it's too broad. For example, we should have tolerance. What does that mean in actual communication terms? We should appreciate cultural differences. What does that mean? So it's a very broad model which doesn't really translate into, so what? What should I do in actual communication? The second issue that I have with Byron's model is that, as you can see, it assumes two cultures: the learner culture and the target culture. Now, the world has changed. How many people in this conference are from 25 different countries? So, in this conference, we at least have people from 25 different cultures. And of course, within those cultures, we have subcultures. So, I don't really think the word intercultural represents the reality now. Because globalisation has spread English all around the world. New varieties of English have developed. All the people are developing their own Englishes to express their own cultural conceptualizations. What I call transcultural mobility calls for a new notion of competence. We can no longer assume that there is source culture and target culture. What is target culture? Even in the old days, this assumption was a mistake. Because even if you stick to the notion of native speakers were from New Zealand, Australia, Canada, America. They're not all the same culture. Australians, a lot of Australians hate Americans. So, I think the notion of intercultural competence is based on a wrong assumption that we're talking just about two cultures. But now, we're talking about really variety of cultures. As I have said, English is now associated with multiple systems of cultural conceptualizations. So, for me, the target in teaching English as an international language needs to be what I call metacultural competence. Intercultural competence assumes two cultures, whereas metacultural competence assumes that we go beyond two cultures. You need to learn about the multiplicity of cultures associated with English. Have a look at the world today, Indians have made English their own language. A lot of Indians speak English as their first language. At home, I had an Indian student who came to my office with her dad, and they spoke English, and I said, "You speak English?" She said, and she said, "Yes." And I said, "What about at home?" She said, "Yeah, we speak English at home." And I said, "So you don't speak Hindi?" And she said, "Yeah, when we go to the village, we speak Hindi with the villagers." So the native speakers of Indian English, a lot of Singaporeans speak Singaporean English as their first language. A lot of Malaysians speak Malaysian English as their first language. Well, nowadays we're talking about Chinese English. 300 million people learn and use English in China. And how many people speak Australian English? 15 million people. So, people are predicting that the most dominant variety of English will be Chinese English. So, if people are talking about Thai English, Korean English, Saudi English, Aboriginal English. So in the world that we're talking about Englishes for international communication, then we need a new notion of competence that goes beyond the notion of native speaker and just one variety. Well, I told you by cultural conceptualizations, I mean cultural schemas, cultural categories, and cultural metaphors. Yesterday I gave examples of cultural schemas encoded in language from Aboriginal English. For example, in Aboriginal English spoken by Aboriginal Australians, the word home means wherever a family member lives. Auntie's house, uncle's house, grandmother's house. So this word, home, in Aboriginal English, encodes a conceptualization, a cultural schema that is not Anglo. In terms of categorization, in Aboriginal English, kinship categories are very different. A person calls her auntie mom because mom is as important as auntie. Auntie is as important as mom. So they call their auntie mom. So this is a cultural category. They call their cousins brother and sister. So when they call someone cousin, that means that person is second cousin. The uncle has a more important role in a child's upbringing than dad. Dad looks after the food, shelter, but uncle introduces the child to the culture of the tribe, takes the child around, introduces the child to the nature, to the sacred sites, initiation. So the uncle has a more important role. So in education of Aboriginal children, we have a saying. We say the teacher's role needs to be like an uncle. And of course, if you're not familiar with the culture, you don't understand what you mean. But a teacher needs to be like an uncle. Because the uncle has the role to introduce the child to the culture, to the spirituality, and that kind of thing. In terms of cultural metaphors, one that I can readily think of is when you refer to your, we heard in the previous talk, a good teacher is a teacher with the heart. Well, everybody has a heart. What does that mean? Because in English, we say the heart is the seat of emotion. So basically, metaphorically, what you are saying is that a teacher needs to act on emotions, not just cognition. So metaphorically, you say the teacher needs to have a heart. Those of you who are from Indonesia would say you need to be a teacher with a liver, because in Indonesian the seat of emotion is hati, it's the liver. In Vietnamese, the seat of emotion is belly. If you're Vietnamese, you're a good teacher if you teach with your belly. I'm not sure about Thai, I can't remember what it is. But because emotions are abstract, we use our body parts to project the emotions. We put them somewhere, even courage. Chinese gallbladder is the seat of courage. So now, when people come to speak English, they bring all these cultural conceptualizations with them in English. Yesterday, I gave an example from Thailand. A simple thing such as greeting. When I was a PhD student, I had a fellow PhD student from Thailand. And every day, around lunchtime, she bumped into me and she would say, I have had my lunch. Have you had your lunch? And I thought, why is she asking me if I have had my lunch? And that was every day. For a long time, I didn't realize why she was saying, I have had my lunch. Have you had your lunch? I was not going to invite you to come to lunch with me, but just say I have had my lunch. And now I realize that greeting in Thai involves mainly not how are you, but have you had your lunch? Or the Chinese version, have you eaten your rice? Or in Cambodia, have you had your shower? So I define metacultural competence as a competence that enables interlocutors to engage consciously in successful communication and negotiation of their cultural conceptualizations during intercultural communication. When I say consciously, I'm now very conscious. Someone, I don't want to name the background, someone saw me eating the sandwich and she said, don't eat that stupid sandwich. Well, I could get offended, but then I paused and I said, in your culture, what does that mean? And she said, well, I care for you. The sandwich is not good for you. So that's what I do these days. Instead of jumping to, why did you say that? I said, what does that mean? So this is where you show that you go beyond the level of one or two cultures. and we allow room for cultural diversity. Although the person is speaking English, it doesn't mean anything. Everybody speaks English, but it doesn't mean that they are all Western people. And we should not expect people to be a Westerner when they speak English. They have their own cultural identity. So, I say metacultural competence develops as a result of familiarity with different systems of cultural conceptualizations and the awareness that one language such as English may be associated with different systems of cultural conceptualizations because it is used by different speech communities. Unlike the very broad and binary notions of culture, I use the word cultural conceptualisation, which is a very specific word. It gives the word culture a dynamic and a pluralistic view of cultural encounters and experiences. So, in other words, the focus of metacultural competence is not on culture itself, but on cultural conceptualizations. So far, I have talked about three aspects of metacultural competence. One is conceptual variation awareness, conceptual explication, and conceptual negotiation strategies. Conceptual variation awareness is the awareness that although this person is speaking English, this person is speaking English, this person is speaking English, but they may be using English to express different systems of cultural conceptualizations. Different varieties of English encode different systems of cultural conceptualizations that may be different from each other. So, to develop metacultural competence, learners should be exposed to different varieties of English. Because different varieties of English may be associated with different systems of cultural conceptualizations. So in this diagram, I'm trying to show that although we're learning English, but there are so many different Englishes. American English, Malaysian English, Chinese English, Cameroon English. African English or African Englishes. It's very common to hear that someone comes to me, even for the first time, and they call me brother, brother. Even I noticed that an African scholar went to my German colleague and said, "How is our son? How is our son?" Meaning, how is your son? Well, imagine if you take it by mistake. Conceptual explication is where people try to explain to others who may not be familiar. That's where Chinese speakers try to explain what the face means in in Chinese. Those of you who are familiar with the Chinese culture, once I brought my Chinese colleague a gift, and that was a clock. And she was extremely offended, because the clock represents death. Well, how would I know? Unless you explain it to me and say, if I were you, I would give a Chinese person a clock as a gift. Conceptual negotiation strategies, and that's where you engage in strategies for smooth and effective communication of cultural conceptualizations. That's where you start asking questions. Two Indonesians came to my office, and I had an Indonesian PhD student. Her name was Anita, and these two said, "We are Anita's friend." And when they left, the next day my student came to see me, and I said, "Your friends were here yesterday." She said, "Farzad, Indonesian friend does not mean anything. We just met at a party, that's it." So the word friend in Indonesian does not have the same meaning. So that's where you start to say, what does friend mean in your culture? Intercultural competence can be developed through the new technology, Skype, Zoom. You can expose your students to students from different cultural backgrounds in order to develop better cultural competence. I don't have the time to go to that. So, in conclusion, English language teaching curricula should aim at developing better cultural competence in learners as a key competence to enable them to communicate and negotiate their cultural conceptualization successfully during intercultural communication. And one way in which ELT curricula can expose learners to the sociocultural reality of and the diversity that characterizes the English language today is to present students with examples of cultural conceptualizations from multiple varieties of English, not just American English or British English. Because as you know, one of the implications of teaching American English and British English is that some Englishes are more equal than other Englishes. That's what happens to learners. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Sharifian, for your talk on cultural linguistics. So now we understand